I called the family meeting for a Sunday afternoon, and by the time everyone had taken their seats around my dining room table, I could already feel the weight of what they all assumed I was about to say. My name is Eleanor. I'm 72, and for 41 years, I built a company from a single flower shop into a regional chain worth just under $14 million. My husband, Walter, and I started it together the year we got married, and after he passed 11 years ago, I ran it alone. By the time I called that family meeting, everyone sitting at my table that Sunday afternoon believed they knew exactly how I intended to divide it. I have 3 children. My son David, 51, had worked in the company's operations division for over 2 decades, steadily, competently, though never with the kind of passion I once hoped he'd bring to it. My daughter Patricia, 48, had built her own successful career as a corporate attorney and had never worked a single day at the company, though she'd made her expectations about her fair third of the eventual inheritance clear at more family dinners than I care to remember. And my youngest, Michael, 44, had spent most of his adult life as something of a disappointment in the family's collective eyes. 3 failed business ventures, a decade of financial instability, a divorce that had strained his relationship with his own 2 children, and a general reputation, unspoken but well understood by everyone at that table, as the sibling who'd never quite lived up to what the family expected of him. I want to be honest about something before I tell you what I decided, because I think the reasons matter as much as the decision itself. For years, I had privately intended to divide the company and its assets evenly between David and Patricia, with a smaller, more modest inheritance set aside for Michael, not out of cruelty, but out of what I genuinely believed, for a long time, was practical realism about which of my children could actually be trusted to steward what Walter and I had built. David had spent 2 decades earning what I assumed was his rightful claim to eventually run the company. Patricia, though she'd never worked there, had always positioned herself as the family's most capable, most successful child, the one whose opinion carried weight at every family gathering, the one who spoke most confidently about what our parents, her grandparents, would have wanted for the family legacy. Michael rarely spoke at those gatherings at all anymore. He'd learned, I think, over years of watching his siblings' confidence dominate every family conversation, that his own opinions weren't especially welcome, and he'd slowly stopped offering them. I hadn't meant to overhear what I overheard the week before that meeting, but I did. I'd stopped by David's house to drop off some paperwork, and through the half-open kitchen door, I heard Patricia's voice, low and certain, talking to David while Michael's car was still pulling out of the driveway. "Mom's not going to hand him anything real," she said. "He can barely run his own life. He doesn't even deserve a vote in this family, honestly." David hadn't disagreed. Later that same week, a neighbor of Michael's, an old friend of mine, mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd overheard David say something to Michael directly outside a hardware store. "You know Mom isn't leaving you anything, right? Don't get your hopes up." I never told either of them I knew. I just carried it with me into that 18-month observation period, and it changed, more than I initially wanted to admit, how closely I decided to look at all 3 of them. What none of them knew, sitting around that table that Sunday, was that I had spent the previous 18 months quietly, carefully, reconsidering everything I thought I understood about my 3 children, and that the decision I was about to announce had almost nothing to do with the plan any of them were expecting. David spoke first, once everyone had settled in with coffee. "Mom, I think we all have a good sense of what today's about. I just want to say, whatever you decide about the company's leadership going forward, I hope we can keep this as smooth a transition as possible, for the business's sake." Patricia nodded along, adding, in the careful, measured tone she used in her legal practice, I think we're all aligned that fairness matters here, Mom. Whatever the specific breakdown looks like. Maybe come Paris. I noticed as she said it. The way her eyes moved briefly toward Michael. A small, almost imperceptible flicker of something that I recognized. Uncomfortably, from years of watching her manage difficult negotiations. The look of someone quietly preparing to argue for a larger share while performing generosity about a smaller one. Michael said nothing. He sat at the far end of the table, hands wrapped around his coffee mug, looking like a man bracing for a verdict he'd already privately accepted as inevitable. I looked at my 3 children, all of them adults now, all of them carrying the particular weight of expectations I realized, sitting there, I had helped create over 4 decades without fully understanding what I was doing. I've spent the last year and a half, I said, watching all 3 of you more carefully than any of you probably realized. And what I found, I think, is going to surprise you. I watched David's confident posture shift slightly. I watched Patricia's careful expression tighten almost imperceptibly. I watched Michael, for the first time in longer than I could remember, actually lift his eyes and look directly at me, instead of at his coffee. Before I tell you my decision, I said, I need to tell you what I actually saw over these past 18 months, because I don't think any of you are going to understand my decision unless you understand what led me to it first. 18 months earlier, without telling any of my children directly, I had begun a quiet, deliberate process of observation, partly triggered by a health scare that turned out, thankfully, to be nothing serious, but that had nonetheless forced me to confront, more urgently than I ever had before, the question of what would actually happen to Holloway Garden Centers, and to my family, once I was no longer around to hold everything together myself. I started with David, since he was the one most visibly positioned to inherit leadership of the company. I asked him to take on a 6-month special project, overseeing the difficult, financially risky expansion of our smallest and most struggling location, a garden center in a declining commercial district that our board had debated closing entirely for 2 years. I told him honestly that I wanted to see how he handled a genuine crisis, not just the steady, well-established operations he'd managed competently for years. What I found, over those 6 months, concerned me more than I let on to anyone at the time. David managed the location's day-to-day operations adequately, but when it came to the harder decisions, difficult conversations with underperforming staff, creative problem solving around the location's declining foot traffic, genuine risk, taking on new revenue strategies, he consistently deferred, delayed, or quietly avoided the hardest calls, preferring instead to maintain the comfortable, low-risk management style that had served him well in stable divisions. But that, I realized watching him, would likely struggle badly if he were ever forced to lead the company through another serious downturn the way I'd had to during the recession years earlier. Patricia was trickier to observe, since she'd never actually worked at the company. So instead, I asked her, under the guise of needing legal guidance on an unrelated family trust matter, to help me quietly review and restructure some of the company's governance documents over several months. A project that gave me an unusually close view of how she actually approached problems when she believed no one important was watching her work, rather than performing confidence at a family dinner table. What I found troubled me in a different way than David's hesitancy had. Patricia was sharp, genuinely skilled at the legal work itself. But in nearly every conversation about the company's future, her suggestions consistently centered around maximizing short-term financial extraction, aggressive dividend structures, faster asset liquidation options, strategies that, would have significantly benefited whichever family members held ownership stakes in the near term, at the expense, I came to believe, of the company's longer-term health and its employees' stability. She never framed it dishonestly, exactly. But watching her operate closely for those months, I understood with a clarity I hadn't had before that Patricia's genuine priority was extracting value from what Walter and I had built, not necessarily preserving or growing it the way we always had. Michael was the one I almost didn't bother observing at all, if I'm being completely honest. A decision I'm ashamed of now, looking back, given what I eventually learned. I only started paying closer attention to him because of an offhand comment from one of my longtime store managers, a woman named Rosa who'd worked for Holloway for over 15 years, who mentioned, almost in passing, that Michael had been quietly volunteering at our downtown location for nearly a year, unpaid, several afternoons a week, helping with everything from inventory management to customer service, without ever mentioning it to me or to either of his siblings. I visited that location myself, unannounced, on a Tuesday afternoon about 4 months into my observation period, and found my youngest son on his knees in the greenhouse section, patiently teaching a nervous first-time customer how to properly repot a struggling fiddle leaf fig, taking real, genuine care with someone who wasn't even a significant sale for the store. Rosa told me when I asked her privately afterward that Michael had been doing this consistently for nearly a year, showing up without being asked, learning the business from the ground level with a kind of humility and genuine curiosity she said she hadn't seen from either of his siblings in years, despite their much longer official tenure or credentials. He never talks about wanting to run the company someday, Rosa told me. He just seems to genuinely love the work itself. The plants, the customers, teaching people things. I don't think he's doing it to impress anyone. I think he's just found something he actually cares about. Finally, after everything he's been through. Nana, I sat with that information for a long time before I finally understood what it actually meant for the decision I needed to make. David, I said, looking at my oldest son across the table, you've given this company 2 decades of steady, reliable work, and I want you to know how much I genuinely value that over these past 6 months, managing the downtown expansion, I watched you consistently avoid the hardest decisions the role required. I don't think that makes you a bad son, or even a bad employee, but I don't believe, honestly, that you're equipped to lead this company through the kind of difficult chapters it will inevitably face again, the way it did during the recession. David's face went through several visible stages of shock, defensiveness, and something that eventually settled into a kind of quiet, wounded acceptance. He didn't argue. I think, somewhere underneath his surprise, he already knew. Patricia, I continued, turning to my daughter, your legal skill is genuinely remarkable, and I'm proud of the career you've built entirely on your own. But watching you work on the trust restructuring these past months, I came to understand that your instincts run toward extraction rather than stewardship. That's not a moral failing. It's simply not what this company, or these employees, need from whoever eventually leads it. Patricia, unlike David, did not accept this quietly. Mom, that's not fair. You're basing this on one project. I'm basing this on 18 months of careful observation, I said, gently but firmly, which is considerably more consideration than I think either of you realize I put into this decision. I saw David's shoulders relax slightly as I said it, some private calculation settling behind his eyes. If Patricia was being ruled out this bluntly, he seemed to be thinking, then surely the company was still coming to him by default. He even glanced, just briefly, toward Michael, with something almost like practiced sympathy. The look of a man already rehearsing how graciously he'd handle being the one left in charge. And I turned to Michael, who was staring at me now with an expression I can only describe as bracing for a blow he'd spent years expecting. "Michael," I said, "I know this family has spent a long time treating you like the disappointment among my 3 children. I'm ashamed to admit that for most of the last decade, I let myself believe that too, more than I should have. But I visited the downtown store 4 months ago and watched you teach a stranger how to care for a struggling plant with more patience and genuine love for this work than I've seen from either of your siblings in years. Rosa told me you've been showing up, unpaid, for nearly a year, without ever once mentioning it to try to impress me or position yourself for anything." I have to know. I watched his eyes fill with something between confusion and disbelief. "I'm leaving controlling ownership of Holloway Garden Centers to you," I said. 60% of the company. David and Patricia will each receive 20% ownership stakes and continued positions on the board, along with a fair, independently structured financial settlement outside the company itself, so that neither of you walks away feeling like this decision left you with nothing but the leadership of what your father and I built for 41 years. That goes to the son who fell in love with the actual work, without ever once asking anyone to notice." Patricia's coffee cup slipped out of her hand and cracked against the table, coffee spreading slowly across the wood while she made no move at all to catch it. David's face drained of color, his mouth opening slightly as though he meant to argue and simply couldn't find where to start. Michael blinked at me twice, genuinely, physically confused, like a man convinced he must have misheard the number, or the name, or both. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I can remember at a family gathering. David sat frozen, processing. Patricia stared at the spreading coffee stain rather than at me, for the first time in longer than I could recall. Genuinely speechless rather than simply performing a reaction for effect. And Michael, my youngest, the one everyone, including myself, had spent years quietly writing off, sat with tears in his eyes, unable, for almost a full minute, to say anything at all. "Mom," he finally said, his voice unsteady, "I don't know what to say. I never once did any of that expecting." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why it needs to be you." The months that followed weren't without difficulty. Patricia, in particular, needed real time to process a decision that upended assumptions she'd carried her entire adult life. And David's transition into a genuinely supportive board role rather than an operational leadership one took patient, honest conversation to navigate without lasting resentment. But 2 years later, Holloway Garden Centers is thriving under Michael's leadership in ways I genuinely didn't anticipate even in my most hopeful moments. He's expanded our sustainable growing practices, rebuilt staff morale at 3 struggling locations, and brought a kind of genuine, patient care to the business that reminds me, more than either of his siblings' approaches ever did, of exactly what Walter and I originally built this company to be. I think about that Sunday afternoon often. The assumptions every one of us walked into that room carrying. The version of the story we'd all quietly rehearsed for years, without ever actually testing it against reality. I spent most of my life assuming I already knew my children, simply because I'd raised them. It took 18 months of actually watching, rather than assuming, to understand how wrong I'd been about which of them truly understood what mattered. My final decision left them speechless that afternoon. But what I've come to believe, watching how it's unfolded since, is that speechless was exactly the right reaction. because the truth I'd finally uncovered was never the story any of us, myself included, had been telling ourselves for years.